The Sino-Soviet split happened in 1961, and just 8 years later, the two would have border skirmishes in Manchuria. These were eventually cooled down and were resolved, but what if they had broken into total war? Would the Warsaw Pact expand into China, or would China become an even larger threat to the Soviets and take Outer Manchuria, speeding up the collapse of the Soviet Union? Let me show you what I came up with. By the late 1960s, the Sino-Soviet split had already reached its peak. Mao Zedong and Leonid Brezhnev's relations that had once scared the West had fully collapsed, and it seemed that nuclear war was about to break out between the two. The territorial disputes in question were very small irregularities along the Usry River, mostly some small uninhabited islands. These resulted in a full-on border skirmishes in March 1969 at Zhembao or Damansky Island, leaving dozens dead. The reason for this border war was not the island itself, but rather let us look at the bigger picture, as China was looking to reverse a century of humiliation, where the Europeans stole land from them, which includes Outer Manchuria that Russia took in 1858. Both sides had started to mobilize troops, and the Soviets even considered preemptive nuclear strikes to damage the Chinese stockpile of nuclear weapons. The Soviets had eventually decided to back down, fearing that the United States might get involved. What happened after that in our history is that the Soviet Union won this border war, which didn't evolve into total war and kept these islands, so nothing had basically changed at the end, but these disputes still remained. As a curious fact, just before the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1991 Sino-Soviet border agreement, this border dispute was fixed in favor of China, as they gained these small islands either way, so this whole conflict was for nothing. Now, how do you get these two countries to go to war, as this is the narrative of the video, and the question remains, would it go nuclear? Well, first off, to achieve these border skirmishes escalating into total war, we have to befriend a really important country that could change the tides of history, Romania. A bit of 180 here, I know, just hear me out. Historically, on the 17th of March 1969, Leonid Brezhnev organized an emergency meeting of the Warsaw Pact with ideas of condemning China. Ceausescu of Romania refused to sign this deal, leading to a lack of Soviet response, leading to a diplomatic failure. This is important as the Soviets would know that they would be supported by their allies if something were to escalate, plus the Soviets would have diplomatic support from their allies in the United Nations. As such, if you have Ceausescu to sign this document to condemn China, then everything would fall in place from there. Historically, on the 24th of March, the Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin directly called Mao Zedong in hopes to negotiate a ceasefire, where the Chinese operator would hang up the phone before it got to Mao Zedong. At this point, many considered the two nations to be at war already, as to the outside world it looked like they had severed diplomatic ties. Sure, the embassies would still work, but during this diplomatic crisis they were useless and neglected, so practically they had severed diplomatic ties, although not officially. For comparison, even the Soviet Union and the Americans in the Cold War, despite being direct rivals, always kept up these phone lines open, and this has surely prevented several conflicts or escalations. After all, the Moscow-Washington hotline was established in 1963, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, so it is understandable that the two sides would want to prevent misunderstandings that would escalate into nuclear war. This goes to show that China in 1969 was acting more hostile to the Soviets than America was, but let me continue. Historically, on the 22nd of March 1969, Soviet diplomats would again try in vain to get in contact with Mao Zedong, but at this point Mao Zedong would order the military to prepare for a possible conflict with the Soviet Union. After this, the crisis historically lasted for a few months, with the Soviets and Chinese trying to gather allies and stop the others. But with this official Soviet condemnation of China in this alternate history, as well as a possibly more escalated Zhenbao Island skirmish, war could possibly break out now. Perhaps the latter option is achieved easily, as historically these border skirmishes were indecisive, as both sides decided to pull out. But if the Soviets just launched retaliatory strikes against China, this could be the escalation that is needed to start a full-blown war. It is possible due to what I said earlier, as I mentioned how the phone line between Beijing and Moscow was basically cut, so a misunderstanding could totally evolve into war, and there is no way for the Soviets and China to reliably communicate, so war is looking very much possible. A demand would soon be sent to Beijing, stating that they had to acknowledge Soviet territories in Outer Manchuria and sign a white peace, but this would be firmly denied. In this alternate history, at this point the Chinese People's Liberation Army would begin full mobilization, and an official declaration of war of the Soviet Union would occur. Now China would have just finished or gotten close to finishing their cultural revolution, so their army would be much weaker than they would have hoped for. However, the People's Liberation Army would still field millions of people, with Mao prioritizing numbers over actual training and weaponry. Remember this, as it's very important later on. After the Chinese declaration of war, the Soviets wouldn't stop their invasion, pushing into Manchuria and taking up the border, hoping to reach the Yellow Sea and finally get a proper warm water port in Asia. Now, this war would not be fought as you may assume due to the harsh terrain, and this is very important as I don't think it will be a conventional war. Let me explain how Russia and China had historically fought over this exact border, so you know what this war would actually look like. The border between the two is mostly the Amur River, which is the 10th longest in the world, and it sucked at being navigable, as it froze for half of the year and was also extremely hard to cross, as there were almost no bridges. Earlier I mentioned how Russia got Outer Manchuria in 1858, and unfortunately for them, when they got the territory, there were plenty of Chinese people there. I wonder why. Originally the Russians tolerated them, but as tensions grew during the Boxer Rebellion and China bombarded the city of Bogoveshchensk, the Russians decided to deport their Chinese population there, just so they don't cause internal trouble and Russia could colonize these lands. The problem is that the terrain was so unbelievably harsh that the modern-day Bogoveshchensk on the Russian side and Heihe on the Chinese side were very isolated, as there was literally nothing else for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. Thus, when the Russians sought to deport their Chinese population, they had no real way of moving 4,008 Chinese people to the other side of the river. As such, they basically gathered them on the river shoreline, pointed guns at them and told them to swim across. Yes, most of them didn't make it across and died, but also it didn't help that the water was literally freezing. I mean, take what I have said so far, the terrain was so harsh that these two cities were so isolated and crossing the river was basically impossible to be done reliably due to poor infrastructure, not to mention of moving artillery or tanks across it. The river, despite being the 10th longest in the world, could be crossed safely only in a few choke points, over which most of the fighting would actually happen. Now, as war would break out here in 1969, don't expect it to be millions of soldiers on both sides of the river, as likely small armies would be fighting, with neither country sending in their full army due to the harsh terrain and the difficulty of supplies. In fact, I would go as far to say that the terrain in Finland during the Winter War of 1940 was actually more favorable for both sides, rather than Manchuria in this alternate history. Imagine that the Amur River, which is the front line in this alternate war, has the same development as the Amazon River in South America, which besides a few cities is mostly empty and underdeveloped, with not a lot of bridges, but also the Amur River was very cold and froze for over half of the year. Basically, imagine that this terrain is similar to the jungles of South America, but it would be harsher as the water would also freeze, hence why you can assume that there would be some limited fighting on the front lines. Now, for how this war would actually be fought, if you remember from earlier, I said that the Chinese during the Boxer Rebellion did shell Bogoveshchensk with artillery, which made the Russians deport and basically massacre all of their Chinese population there. This I think is important as it proves to me that artillery is going to be very important in this war, but also aerial combat, so this war would be mostly fought over the skies rather than the ground, but also both sides would have a big red button ready to press just in case. But wait, Mongolia is also in the war and on the side of the Soviet Union, potentially being promised Inner Mongolia from China, so the front lines would be much larger, but would be fought in, you guessed it, the Gobi Desert, the 6th largest desert in the world. And just like with the Amur River, the terrain here would be very sparsely populated, so moving large armies around would be very difficult. It doesn't take a genius to figure out that this potential war would stalemate, but let me make it a lot more interesting. North Korea was originally allied to the Soviet Union, but at this point in their history they were more so leaning towards China. I think that North Korea could join the war, but under the right circumstances. Kim Il-sung would be in a very awkward spot, as his nation depended both on China and the Soviet Union, so joining one side would alienate the other, thus being suboptimal. The North Koreans would begin to fear that the Soviet Union could encircle them if the Soviets win in this border war and take Manchuria, which is where I can see North Korea to join China and try to prevent the Soviets from winning. Basically, I would say that if North Korea decides to join the war at all, it would be once the Chinese start losing heart, but on the contrary, North Korea may realize that at this point it's a little too late and they may decide to join the Soviets for a few border corrections with China. The fact is that North Korea wouldn't be of much help to either side, as if they side with the Soviets, well, good news, the front lines with China would be now much larger, but the border is also the Changbai mountain range, whose highest peak, Jangun Peak, is slightly shorter than that of Mount Olympus in Greece. Basically, take the stereotypical inland terrain of Greece, rather than the beaches, and apply it to the border of China and North Korea. Crossing it en masse would also be very difficult. On the other hand, if North Korea decides to side with China against the Soviet Union early on, they would be very close to Vladivostok, which is about 125 kilometers away from the borders, or close to 100 miles. The problem is that the Soviets are likely going to defend this choke point, and there is only one single bridge connecting the two, the Korea-Russia Friendship Bridge, which is likely going to get blown up. So North Korea and China would again have to cross a similar river to the Amur, well into fortified Soviet positions, thus it's impossible. All of this is to say that North Korea joining either side in my opinion wouldn't matter too much. Sure, they can provide millions of soldiers to either side, but with this harsh terrain something else is needed, which is air power, missiles, bombs and technology. For now, I would have North Korea to remain neutral, waiting to see how this war would play out and evaluating their options for which side they should join, or whether they should remain neutral. Really quickly, let's cover the international community's reaction and how they would be acting after the first month of the war fighting out, so around May of 1969. Starting with Asia, nations like Japan and South Korea would be partially panicked, partially ecstatic. Why is that, you may ask? Well, first of all, it's not impossible to assume that the war could spill over into their borders, or that they could suffer collateral damage. But on the other hand, the two largest communist threats in the world would be fighting each other, which could result in a more advantageous position for them. America could even encourage China, seeing them as a way to weaken their main rival of the Soviet Union. Going over to India, they would also be rather intrigued due to their rivalry with China. Most likely we would get a stalemate from the Indian government supporting the Soviets in the conflict, but nothing more than that. In Southeast Asia, the Vietnam War would still be raging on, but I think it would change drastically. With China now focusing on its own war against the USSR, aid to the Viet Cong and other paramilitary groups in Indochina would be cut, possibly leading to a more successful war for the South. If this leads to South Vietnam coming out on top is hard to say, but American troops may remain in Vietnam for longer, so while we cannot know what exactly happened next, North Vietnam is definitely altered, as their two main backers would be directly at war, and if the American public pressure is not as great as it was historically against war, the American soldiers could remain there and help the South greatly. Going to America and the West as a whole, they would be very cautious. This war would see two major nuclear powers going to war against each other, and while both would be hostile for sure to the West, it could still lead to nuclear hellfire. America would be interested in opening up relations with China, which in this timeline might not be refused as easily. Going to Asia, as the war would progress, the United States would begin to covertly support China, with the CIA possibly doing what they do best in Outer Manchuria. Now let's head back to the war. After the first few weeks of this alternate war, thousands would already be dead from both sides, mostly from attrition rather than actual combat. The Soviet population and their allies would be quite united due to China technically being the aggressor, or at least being framed as such, while for the Chinese I think that they would be in a rather poor position. Soon after the conflict would break out, Xinjiang might begin to experience revolt from ethnic Kazakhs and Uyghurs. These would be very small in scale, but would be supported by the Soviets. The USSR would also encourage ethnic Mongolians in Inner Mongolia to rise up and join Mongolia's causes, but these calls to arms would be much less successful. Also, Tibet may see some other issues, but overall these would be small rebellions that China likely easily would crush. 3 months into the war and likely not a lot would change, as both sides would have rather small armies than they can usually field on the front lines. This is again because of the terrain, but I would give the advantage to the Soviet Union, where they would begin to cross the Amur River and start to capture some important cities on the border. Why exactly you may think this is the case? Well, the Soviets I would imagine would dominate the skies and start bombing the Chinese infrastructure in Manchuria. The Soviets undoubtedly had the most airplanes, better radar technologies and better pilot training. In 1969 the Soviet Union had about 7,500 combat aircraft, but of course not all would be committed to China, just in case something does escalate with the West, while the Soviets had major airports and military bases in Vladivostok, Khabarovsk, Bogoveshchensk and Chita, all of which would be in striking distance of Chinese Manchuria. Now China on the other hand would have about half of the airplanes of the Soviet Union, which is to say that they would have about 3,000 aircraft by 1969, but the problem is that they were mostly obsolete Soviet models from the 1950s, which is to say that they would be about 2 decades old by this point. China not only did have fewer and worse aircraft, but also their radar technology was very bad, and their pilot training was even worse due to the Cultural Revolution. What China had going for them is that they had many small airfields close to the front lines. Thus the Soviets cannot achieve full air superiority, and I think that we can compare this to the Battle of Britain in 1940, where the Germans had the advantage in terms of air, but weren't able to replenish their losses, as downed German pilots were captured by the enemy. Germany couldn't win the Battle of Britain because they couldn't bomb all pieces of concrete on the island, and thus they couldn't achieve total air superiority. For the Soviet Union, I think that it would be very similar. They definitely would have the advantage in the early war and would destroy plenty of the enemy's infrastructure and airplanes, but China would still have a lot of airplanes over the skies, which would engage in battles with the Soviets, where I can see China to mostly lose, but perhaps the Soviets cannot replenish their losses, and as the war would go on, it would look a lot more difficult. As for the Soviet Union's army on the ground and why I think that they would cross the river, essentially due to the earlier mentioned air superiority, they can delay much of the Chinese reinforcements, and thus the Soviets can establish beachheads on the other sides of the Amur River. As I said earlier, the terrain was very harsh, so it wouldn't support millions of soldiers on both sides, but rather smaller and professional armies. As China's strategy was to have quantity over quality, wanting to have an army of millions of soldiers with poor training and equipment, I can see the Soviets to overpower them in the beginning. But the problem is that as time goes on and the Soviets capture more land, then the Chinese soldiers would eventually be able to face them in mass numbers. Thus I think that the Soviets taking any major cities in Manchuria besides Heihe would be impossible. Further, as the war would start in March 1969, the Amur River would have been mostly frozen by this time, which would allow the Soviet Red Army to march across it in large numbers and overpower the local Chinese garrisons. But as the months would go by and the summer would come around, the Amur River would not be frozen anymore, and thus the Soviets on the other bank of the river would likely be somewhat stranded, as reinforcements and resupplies would be difficult there. Since the Soviet Union would have the air dominance, they can airdrop supplies in the beginning, but this is not a reliable strategy they can use for the entire war. By the time the month of June comes around, the Soviet Union would begin to move nuclear weapons closer to China. Moscow would be in an internal debate over whether or not they should use them, with Brezhnev hesitating, fearing that the world would condemn the USSR and possibly support China even more. Remember that in our history the Soviets really did plan to launch such massive preemptive nuclear strikes on China's nuclear facilities, but if they drop nukes or not is difficult to say at this point. Perhaps they would have the advantage in the early war, so them using nukes right now would not be needed, or perhaps the opposite is true, where they could see how the tides of the war could shift against them a year or so into the fighting, so they could decide to strike now while they're winning, so they can pacify China. I think that anything is possible, so I will touch upon this event that could alter the world's history slightly later. From here there are two options that we can do, either A, the war would stalemate and both sides would mediate a peace deal as nobody would want to continue fighting, or option B, things would get spicy, they would get hot, they would get mushroomy, China would have anime, if you know, you know. For the sake of this video I would go over both scenarios, and you can judge which one is the most interesting. Starting with option A, both powers would seek to end this war as soon as possible, as China would be suffering from riots and minor economic collapse, as they wouldn't have had time to recover from the Cultural Revolution just yet. The Soviet Union would also be suffering similar issues, as well as possible sanctions and the fear of NATO intervening. After a month or so of stalemate, the two would finally agree to a ceasefire. This would see the Soviet Union and China to mostly return to their pre-war borders, with the presence of an international commission used to divide the disputed territories. A demilitarized zone and the United Nations peacekeepers might be deployed there as well, but no formal reparations would be given to either side. The immediate aftermath of the war would be troublesome for both sides. In China, the Cultural Revolution's success would be largely scaled back, and a large dip would occur in the Chinese economy. This would set China back for a few decades, and the rise of China may be slowed down, or possibly even prevented in this alternate history. President Nixon would visit China a lot sooner, as the two would have gotten closer over this conflict, and their markets would begin to open up. In Xinjiang, even after the war, the Soviet-backed revolutionaries would continue fighting, with the Soviet Union claiming that they have nothing to do with it. This would continue for a few decades, further holding China back. In Southeast Asia, the Chinese government may decide not to invest in the Vietnam War anymore, as the damage they would have taken during this conflict might be too much to ignore. This could be smart, as historically China pretty much invaded communist Vietnam due to Cambodia, so despite China and Vietnam both being communist, eventually China just created an enemy on their doorstep, which would be a similar case if South Vietnam would win this conflict, but China would save a lot of money. Now, does this mean that South Vietnam would unite Vietnam instead? Well, I think that this is unlikely. By this point, the Viet Cong still had the much better hand, as well as many other advantages in the war. We could see American troops remaining in South Vietnam for longer, and potentially doing slightly better, but the American public would still want to leave the war in the end, as we have made no further changes to America to prevent this from happening. In fact, a war between two nuclear powers, which just happened in this alternate history, could make the American public more wary of sending troops abroad, fearing that this could cause an escalation and result in nuclear war. So either America is more committed to the Vietnam War and doing better, or the American public puts even more pressure to end it. Regardless, I find the most likely option to be a Viet Cong victory, but much less decisive, taking longer and the cost of more human lives. After that, the Viet Cong would be basically free to run wild in Indochina, as China might not want to prop up governments in Cambodia and Laos. This could possibly lead to Indochina being united under Vietnam, or more likely Vietnam subjugating Cambodia and Laos, with minor territorial adjustments. This would be a very interesting side effect of this alternate conflict. As for the Soviet Union, the picture is even worse. The communist parties of the world would now drift away from them, and they would kind of lose the head of the communist world feather on their hat. After that, the communist world would be kind of headless, as China certainly isn't going to pick it up. Overall, communism would drop in popularity in the West, leading to a lot more stable politics in France and Italy, for example. In the Warsaw Pact, many nations would begin to see the USSR as weak, and might try to make a move. Discontent there would be very high, as before that, in 1956 the Hungarians were brutally crushed by the Soviet Union, but most importantly for our scenario, the Prague Spring. Historically, it happened in 1968 and lasted for almost an entire year, where Alexander Dubček of Czechoslovakia had basically tried liberalizing the country, free press, less censorship, and overall the creation of socialism with a human face. This was absolutely unacceptable, and thus the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact basically invaded Czechoslovakia in August of 1968. This is important as it created a Brezhnev doctrine, where basically the USSR claimed the right to intervene anywhere where socialism was under threat. Also, on a side note, if you remember that Romania decided not to support the Soviet Union against China, this is because Ceausescu feared the Brezhnev doctrine, as he thought that it could be used against him. So this scenario would hit our first roadblock, as perhaps it's more realistic for the conflict to escalate on its own. Still, going back to Eastern Europe, the Czechoslovaks would have been basically crushed a year prior to the Soviet Union and China fighting this brief war and signing this peace treaty. As the Soviet Union loses even more legitimacy, their puppets in Eastern Europe would become a lot more rebellious and discontent would rise, this is for sure. The 1970 Polish protests may be a lot larger and more widespread. African nations might try to withdraw themselves from the Soviet Union, as to not become a target of the CIA, and possibly open up to the West. Hungary might try again at the whole revolution thing, but it would probably fail again. While the Warsaw Pact wouldn't collapse, it would be on the way to do so. The Soviet Union would also begin to enter more of an arms race with China now, further draining their military budget, as China would become a permanent enemy in this alternate history, rather than a hostile but still kind of a neutral country on their border. As a result of that, Soviet Siberia may become a lot more developed, as the Soviets would want to station more armies there, or on the contrary, they can use the Guyana strategy and don't build anything valuable on their border with China. Thus, if the enemy does decide to invade, there is nothing to take for hundreds of miles, and they would all die from attrition. I like the idea of Siberia being more developed, so I would go with this option, although it doesn't really matter much. In the end, with a much less popular Soviet Union, more military spending, and a much worse off economy, we could see communism to collapse much sooner than historically, possibly into the 1980s. It may sound weird, but I have made a video on the Soviet Union surviving, where I explored their economy, or more so the stagnation in the 1970s until their collapse. What I want you to take away from it, so I don't repeat myself, is that the Soviet economy would begin to become really bad, and in this alternate history it would get basically worse. Then the Soviets would probably invade Afghanistan like in our history, and therefore they could collapse. Now here is how this alternate collapse could look like in my opinion. Eastern Europe would be freed, as the Soviet economy cannot handle propping up decent popular regimes there, which would see plenty of revolts and unrest, costing the Soviets even more money, further making their situation even worse. Basically, the Soviets have to pull out and the USSR would dissolve peacefully like in our history, and it wouldn't break into million pieces like the last time I made a video on them. But with Central Asia now independent, the revolts in Xinjiang would spread like wildfire, with ethnic Kazakhs wanting to join back up with their respective nation, and ethnic Uyghurs there wanting independence. While China would be weakened, I don't think that they would give up on this territory so easily, and a sort of a Tiananmen Square situation would happen again. Now you may wonder what is a Tiananmen Square situation, which is to say that nothing would happen. One was side trip to Vietnam, their acceptance into the Western markets may be harder than in our history. With their conquest of Indochina, they may have been isolated from China, assuming that China doesn't decide to bite the bullet and open up trade with them, which I doubt that they would, and most likely China instead would invade them like historically, rather than decide to work with them. America may also not open up to the Vietnamese Indo-China market, seeing as how they have radically expanded there, threatening American allies in the region like Thailand, which would see larger communist uprisings in this timeline, but they would still be suppressed, while also partially proving the domino effect theory correct, to which I have also made a video on it continuing. Well, in this timeline, nothing too interesting would happen, and this is probably the best case scenario for the West. Weaker China, communism would fall sooner in the Soviet Union, everybody would be happy but the communists, and nuclear war would be avoided. Jokes aside, there are probably massive implications with the Soviet Union close to a decade collapsing sooner, and Eastern Europe being freed up, as for example Yugoslavia could implode sooner. The German unification would happen before the destruction of the Berlin Wall, and overall I'm sure that we have greatly butterfied away the modern day. The thing is that I have another scenario to cover, which is the war escalating even more, so take this as a somewhat realistic and peaceful scenario, which is perhaps a bit boring, as nothing ever happens, just like on Tiananmen Square, where also nothing ever happened. Now this was the first ending, now let us start a nuclear war and have a fun scenario, as I already gave you a somewhat plausible outcome. This would be the most fun option. No, scratch that. Much more interesting is more like it. We'll be turning back the clock to the stalemate in the conflict and see what would happen if the war decided to continue and peace was not signed. We could have this effect occur by the Soviets taking more of Manchuria, or at least them seemingly having the upper hand by more than the previous timeline. It would be very unrealistic considering the terrain, but if we tweak a few of the specifics like logistics and troop movements, plus winning the air battle decisively, it's not impossible. I would have the Soviets to push down towards Shenyang and have a successful capture there to occur, with them still being stopped before the Yellow Sea, thus they would basically take most of Manchuria. In this case, North Korea could decide to join China and would also be mostly occupied, or at the very least they would remain neutral but lean towards the Soviets, or hey, maybe they join them as to gain a bit more land, which would have happened here as well, since I'm a North Korean nationalist. As the offensive would stall around the month of November 1969 due to the winter and the harsh terrain, both sides would begin to prepare for the cold weather and prolonged conflict, and slow movements that would happen in the next few months. At this point the Soviet economy would begin to drag, while China would be able to begin fully mobilizing and make the most of this wait as it delays actual combat. The nation would be rallied and the army would be equipped, as the West likely supports the Chinese as they want to weaken the Soviets, with a much larger force showing up in Manchuria by the time spring comes around. During the winter the fighting could switch to Central Asia. While this area in the world has not a lot of best of anything really, it would be much more fit for combat than in Manchuria. The Soviets would see minor successes there, with them possibly connecting themselves to the Uyghur revolts, or at least some of them. If they decide to officially recognize Uyghurstan here isn't unlikely, but they would probably refrain from doing so as to not antagonize the international community more so than they already have. This winter would also see meetings in the United Nations trying to discuss a peace deal, which with the Soviets in a better position, the USSR would refuse unless it directly benefited them. NATO would also be meeting in Brussels as to discuss their possible involvement, but this wouldn't be anything more than possibly militarizing more. Japan and South Korea would be much more active at this point however, with South Korea drafting up plans to invade the North no matter the outcome. Japan would possibly begin to set their sights on building up their military industry as well, but the United States would keep the two from doing anything stupid, like escalating the war. At this point, some incidents between the Soviet Union and the West are bound to happen. For example, historically on the 1st of September 1983, a South Korean airline was shot down by the Soviets, killing all 269 people on board and further escalating the Cold War tensions. A similar incident occurring in this alternate Sino-Soviet War I see as very plausible, so the West would for sure increase their involvement there, as it would be the biggest escalation of the Cold War so far, even bigger than the Cuban Missile Crisis in my opinion. This is because two nuclear powers would be directly at war, which is the first time it would happen in history, so tensions would be very high. India would at this point be a firm supporter of the Soviet Union in this conflict, as a Soviet victory would weaken their main rival of China, as well as give them a chance to formally rebuke all claims that China had on their territory. India would most likely allow the Soviets to use their territory to station spies and other military weaponry targeted to China. The Chinese may decide to bomb Soviet military bases in India in response, but with the fear of the Indians joining the side of Moscow, it would be up in the air. Pakistan would directly go closer to Moscow and pose as a counterbalance to India. The West would place sanctions on both of these nations and demand that they stop getting so close to these communist powers, but it would lead to them going even closer to them, as they would have no other alternative due to these sanctions. Now back to the war. In the spring of 1970, the Soviets would be hoping to start their advances again. Their internal efforts may be successful, with slightly more territory falling to them, but it would be stopped very quickly. China would have been preparing for a counterattack for this scenario that we're in, and they would launch it around the start of the summer. This attack would be ruthless, deploying millions of soldiers against the Soviet Union, which would have been difficult for both sides to supply, but likely worse for the Soviets. This Chinese attack would deal a great amount of damage, and would probably result to the Soviets having to retreat to more defensible positions, such as the Nen River. A fierce defense would be had by the Soviets there, as they would want to retain the upper hand, but as time goes on, it would be obvious that the Soviet Red Army is just too undersupplied in the region, and that China would eventually reclaim it, and perhaps reverse the tides of the war and start pushing into the Soviet Outer Manchuria. The same could be said for their army in Xinjiang. While Chinese gains there would be much more minimal, neither side can really sustain an army there. At this point, the Soviet High Command is starting to consider the possibility of defeat. However, at this point in the war, defeat would mean land concessions, and this was not something that the Soviets wanted to partake in. This is when the idea of using small-scale nuclear weapons would come into play, which, let me remind you, was historically considered. One being dropped in Beijing on Shanghai could change the course of the war in favor of the Soviet Union. As losses on the battlefield would begin to mount, the world would continue to turn against the Soviets. Well, more against them than usual, I guess. So the idea to use at least the threat of nukes to sign a favorable peace terms for the Soviets would be floated around. It's not unlikely that this idea would be enacted upon, and it's not unlikely it's going to happen because we want to, else we practically return to the previous scenario, with the Soviets collapsing in a similar way, but China would have Outer Manchuria, so not a great difference from what we have discussed previously. This is the second most realistic ending, but the secret third ending is much more interesting, so I would continue. As Chinese intelligence begins to pick up the movements of nuclear weapons into Siberia, they would already start suspecting the worst. A preemptive statement about what China would do in response to Soviet nuclear warfare would be given, which sums up to nuclear Armageddon. There is one issue to this. At this point, China had roughly 200 nuclear weapons. The Soviets had 8 times that amount. The USSR would take this threat with a grain of salt and threaten to use nuclear weapons on military targets in Manchuria and Xinjiang if China doesn't sue for peace. The United Nations would immediately step in and condemn the Soviet Union for threatening the use of nuclear weapons, and would state their own response if they decide to launch them. From here we can go two ways: either A, the Soviets back down and eventually sign a peace treaty that benefits China, which was the previous ending, or B, screw it, we bow. I would be going with option B for entertainment purposes, as I already gave you two realistic outcomes. Despite the warnings of the United Nations, the Soviets decide to use their nuclear arsenal, not all of it mind you, just a handful, 10 at most. This would most likely occur in the fall of the year of 1970, with hopes of an offensive by the Red Army riding on these strikes. These nukes would hit important military bases such as dockyards and supply hubs, which would be devastating in Xinjiang and Manchuria. Directly after these strikes, the Soviet Red Army would move to capitalize on it, capturing more land in Manchuria due to the chaos that it would have caused and millions of Chinese that would die, and a substantial part of their army would likely desert, fearing the worst. In Xinjiang, the already thin Chinese supply lines would most likely be fully severed, which would lead to overall collapse of the Chinese People's Liberation Army in the region. At this point, the Soviet Union might prop up Uyghurstan in Xinjiang, which would be very much pro-Soviet. Territories with Kazakh and Kyrgyz populations would also be annexed into the USSR, with their respective SSRs expanding into them. The month of September 1970 would see overall Soviet offenses, but failed to reach their peak in Manchuria. The United Nations would sanction the Soviet Union into the ground, causing their economy to fall further, which coincides with their era of stagnation, plus now they're also fighting in a war. In the Warsaw Pact, more and more anti-Soviet protests would occur, with the largest ones being in Poland and Czechoslovakia, which would all very quickly spread. Foreign communist parties would sever ties with Moscow and condemn the use of nuclear weapons as well. In Japan and South Korea, panic would be rampant, as the Soviets would be viewed as willing to launch nuclear weapons. China would suffer greatly from these nuclear strikes, but not fail completely. Retaliatory nukes would also be used on Soviet infrastructure in Siberia, with Vladivostok possibly being hit directly. Again, the United Nations would attempt to get involved and negotiate a peace deal, which would obviously fail abysmally, with the USSR refusing as they think that they would have the upper hand, and China would refuse because at this point a peace treaty would benefit the Soviet Union and not them. With these negotiations failing, the first ever large-scale nuclear war would fully erupt, with both sides using their arsenals. At first it would be military targets, such as industry, supply lines, ports and fortifications, but as the war would drag on into its third year, the Soviet Union would most likely try for a killing blow. By the summer of 1971, most of China's nuclear weapons would be used up, and they would be pushed out of Xinjiang and Manchuria, but by this point no matter what the Soviets do, it's unlikely that they could win this conflict outright, and China just wouldn't surrender. So the Soviets would have to try something drastic. The Soviets would nuke Beijing and try to force a surrender. This move would result in the international community swamping the Soviet Union with sanctions, pulling out investments and cutting off diplomacy. Even India would break up their friendship with the Soviets over this. The United Nations would demand that the USSR would sign a peace treaty to end this war, or else they would face an invasion of a force of NATO countries. In the Warsaw Pact, the member states would be so tired of this war and many protests would turn into riots, and possibly a revolution. In China itself, the Soviets would push south, but overall gain nothing of value. The external pressure would finally force the Soviets to crumble, and they would have to sign a peace treaty in 1971. The peace treaty would be minimal. Uyghurstan would be made as a free state, and the Soviets would be forced to leave Manchuria. After this, the Warsaw Pact and the communist world wouldn't be able to last. We could see the collapse of communism as early as 1972, but most likely sometime around 1975. With Xinjiang unable to sustain itself on their own, without the USSR to back it up, it would be forced back into China with some more autonomy. The Soviet Union would collapse like historically, but almost 20 years sooner. With the Warsaw Pact gone, NATO application in Eastern Europe would be faster and less polarizing, as Russia would begin to be seen as a threat that would be willing to use nuclear weapons whenever they want. Ukraine and Belarus may decide to keep their nuclear arsenals instead of giving them back to Russia, which I can see happening with Western approval, while for Kazakhstan it's more up in the air. In China, the Chinese economy would crumble on itself, but it would remain stable. South Korea may decide to take an advantage of a very weak north and launch an operation to unite the peninsula, which China wouldn't be able to contest. The rise of China almost certainly doesn't happen here, and China may remain a secondary power for a longer amount of time. America would have truly won the Cold War, and it didn't even need to fight. With communism falling so early on, the world has changed drastically. First up, South Vietnam might manage to win in this scenario, which is an interesting option to consider. Secondly, the entire war on terror might be prevented, or at the very least changed drastically. This would be due to the lack of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, where America funded and effectively built the groups that began the Great Conflict. Third, America would remain at the center of power in the world, and would remain the world's uncontested strongest economy for decades to come, as China rising would be delayed by several decades. But was it really worth it? Make sure to subscribe as it helps me out make more videos like this. You can also check out this video where the Soviet Union collapses into civil war instead of dissolving peacefully. I wish you the best day possible and goodbye.